Hi, Al.
Hi, Sandy.
Stan.
Hi, Rebecca. Haven't seen.
Oh,
Good
yeah,
morning, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you.
That's great.
I've been here, but I've been on mute the whole time.
So good to see you and everybody else too.
Yes.
Hi, Judy.
I don't see my friend Paul Kalis. I don't know, where is he?
Oh, welcome. Yes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
I think he's open, but not there.
Oh, John and Dixie. Hi, John. Hi, Dixie.
Well, I see John.
Yeah. Oh, Dorothy.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's so good to see you all. How's
See.
everybody doing? Okay,
We're
Good.
all healthy.
so let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. And then I'm so eager to talk about this last chapter. I think this last chapter is just, for all the reasons we'll talk about, is such a very important chapter. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So our agenda today is the epilogue of Doris Kearns Goodwin's book. She's taken us through the early years, the Depression years, and the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in today's chapter, she talks about what happened to, of course, Lincoln died in office. He was assassinated, and FDR died in office shortly after being reelected in 44. But what were their last days like? And then she talks about the post-presidency of Theodore Roosevelt and LBJ. So before we, look in detail at all that, what were your general reactions to this chapter? It was a different kind of chapter. It was shorter. It was shorter. It was more synoptic, looking at all four. What was your general reaction to this chapter in the context of the overall book? Anybody? Dottie, and please unmute.
Wait a minute.
It didn't call, did it?
You want to unmute the mic? Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
you're perfect now. I can hear you. Thank you.
The thing that got me about the whole book, obviously they didn't have anti-depression drugs. The four of them were all deceased by the time they were 65 years old. I mean, when you think about it, our new president will be 78, and you look back at the ages, they never made it beyond, I think President Roosevelt was 64. Lyndon Johnson predicted his own demise at 64. Abraham Lincoln, they were all so depressed. And I think after reading this, I don't think I'd want to be president. It's such a difficult job. I thought perhaps you had to have an ego. That was my feeling, to want to be head of not the whole world, but the United States. But it's a sad comment that these men did not have what today is a fairly young life. I mean, they were gone before they could collect Social Security.
Yeah, that is absolutely fair point, Dottie. I mean, right, they all died, from our point of view, they all died young,
Young.
you know, and we have an incoming president who's 78 years old. So, and they died by 64, 65. So yes, so one thing to note is just the lack of longevity that they all shared. What were some other, how did this chapter connect with you as a human, with you as a reader? Anybody? David Kopelman.
Well, just one observation, reading the chapter. One was that Teddy Roosevelt said people were saying the nomination could be his, but he had given his word to support Taft. He had second thoughts about it. And probably if he had gone back on his word, he probably could have secured the nomination and would have been elected instead of Taft. So here's a situation where he was true to his word, true to his promise, to his detriment. And the same thing happened with Lincoln. Lincoln was planning to go to theater, at least according to what
Right.
Doris Kearns writes, and that he said, I'd much rather stay here with my friends, enjoying chatting with my friends, but I promised I would be there. People are expecting to see me there. So I've got to keep my word. Had he not kept his word, he perhaps might have avoided assassination. So here's two presidents who were intent on keeping their word. Their word was their bond, and yet doing so led to their detriment.
It's striking when you think about what's happened to the currency of our word and how the currency of our word has been radically devalued in today's world. It's absolutely striking, right? Can you imagine any president of either party today being bound by what how Teddy Roosevelt felt bound by what he said? They would reconsider, or it wasn't the case. You took it out of context, yada, yada, yada. But it was just a different world where your word was your bond. And that's also changed. So they died young and they actually took their word seriously. And those are two moves that are very different in our own time. Thank you, David, and thank you, Dottie. Other reactions to this chapter? Cheryl or Paul Kalis, if you can unmute, please.
I'm going to respond not exactly to the chapter, but to the book in general. Because Doris Kearns Goodwin worked for Johnson, she had a totally different view of him. And she painted him as a civil rights icon. And he turned out to be a civil rights icon. But is there any evidence that he was a civil rights icon while he was in Congress before he became vice president?
Well, I'm not a Johnson scholar, Paul, but the evidence seems to be no. I mean, as I understand it from her book and from other sources, he really evolved. He evolved. And the evidence that he's a civil rights icon is the Civil Rights Act in '57 that he got passed when he was the Speaker of the Senate, or when he was the leading senator in the Senate for the Democratic Party. And then the 64 Act, the 65 Act, and the 68 Public Accommodations Act. Those are all the pieces of evidence. But beforehand, I know he's a creature of the South, and he was very much limited by that. So I think the answer is he evolved. I found I found that last vignette of him. He was sick and weak and could hardly breathe, and he schleps himself to that speech. And Lady Bird knows exactly what he's doing, and she basically says, he has a little bit of health left, and he wants to spend it on this. He knows what he's doing. He's spending his last health on this. So it seemed like it was a true conversion, Paul, but it was a conversion. Cheryl Kalis. Marilyn.
I thought it was sad that so many of the policies were overturned and not followed through with their deaths, especially Lincoln had visions of Reconstruction that never took place. Lyndon B. Johnson, the follow through of his civil rights bills weren't what he would have pushed through, continued to push through. And Roosevelt, he wanted to live to see the United Nations. I just thought it was sad in many ways.
Yeah, Marilyn, I think and I think that's a good point of departure. I want to just talk about the emotional resonance of that chapter, Marilyn, because you used sad. First of all, I found the epilogue chapter, for me personally, just speaking as a reader, by far the most relevant and universally applicable of all the chapters, because none of us is a president, and none of us will ever be a president of the United States who is on this call, right? We don't have to deal with the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't have to deal with the Industrial Revolution. We don't have to deal with the Great Depression. We don't have to deal with fighting Adolf Hitler. And we don't have to deal with America's original sin. It's racism and slavery and the place of Black Americans. None of us has to deal with that, but all of us, 100% of us have to deal with, and some of us are in real time dealing with this issue of epilogue, this issue of how do we think about the chapter in our life when we are post the work of our life? How do we think about the chapter of our life when we're post the work of our life? And I found in that sense, while none of us is presidents, what we actually have in common with all four men, particularly Theodore Roosevelt and LBJ, is the chapter when we're post what we were known for when we were known for something, but we're still here on planet Earth. And what are we going to do with our epilogue? And I found that, I mean, and let me just state the issue quite clearly as I experienced it. One big move in Newton, Massachusetts, if you live in 02458, or if you live in 02459, and if you've had a successful career, and if you retire at whatever age, one big move, I mean, it's as demonstrable, is you move to Florida and you have the snowbird years. And I'm not critical at all. I mean, God bless. God bless. And you go to Florida and you have a community of snowbirds and it's sunshine. And if you have this issue with where your limbs get cold in the winter and tingly and you lose sensation, you don't have that. You can walk and it's 70 degrees and it's lovely. And you can golf and you can go out to restaurants and it's lovely, right? And you play golf. If you play golf, oh my God, right? And the people who do that, they vote with their feet and they do that every year. And we have scores of members who go to Florida and do that. And that's lovely. But this is a different model. These guys were working their butt off until their last breath. They were working their butt off until their last breath on noble issues that they cared about. You know, Theodore Roosevelt wrote this whole Magna Carta on the rights of the forgotten man in the Industrial Revolution, literally on his last day, and then he died. He wrote this, and a lot of it anticipated the New Deal, and a lot of it anticipated what we're working about 100 years later. And he wrote this the day before he died. You know, LBJ spends his last energy giving a speech on civil rights. So I think, you know, Marilyn, you talked about sad. So I just want to put that out. It's a different model of epilogue. Do we spend our epilogue years in Florida, in retirement, with the sun, with the golf, with the early bird? Or do we spend our retirement, you know, fighting for some noble ideal, whatever our noble ideals are? And then, to Marilyn's point, and this is, we'll get to the Torah in a minute, but they all fail in a fundamental way. They strive and they reach. And I agree with Marilyn 100%, right? Abraham Lincoln dreamed of a whole new world for Black people, for our country, and you get Jim Crow, and you get the Riven America, and you get Jim Crow. Theodore Roosevelt dreamt for a fair deal for a square deal, a fair deal for the forgotten man, and they got it worse than ever. 100 years later, the same thing, etc. FDR dreamed of a new peace, and we got the Cold War. You know, LBJ dreamed of real equality for Black people, and we got mass incarceration. So it's in a sense of this great striving, and they died, and their noblest ideals still need work. So I just want to put that out there. It's a whole epilogue was a double entendre. It was the epilogue of the book, and the epilogue of the book is about the epilogue of our life, and how do we want the epilogue of our life to look like? So thoughts, comments, and questions about all that. Maddie Donoff and then Annette Miller.
I was struck by the fact that each of their goals, each of their unfulfilled quests at the end are what we're looking at today. They were all working towards making changes to our country, to our people, and we're still working on those same problems today. I found that this deja vu, it just was very upsetting to me to think that the kinds of progress we think we've made, we really haven't made, because we're working on the same issues. We may call it different things, but they're the same problems.
Can we just dwell on that, Maddie? I mean, you're absolutely right. We're still dealing with racial justice. We're still dealing with giving the Black person a fair shake. We're still dealing with our riven country. We're multiple Americas within one America. We're still dealing with the forgotten person who's screwed by the Industrial Revolution or the technological revolution. And, you know, we're still dealing with, you know, the Cold War. I mean, see the evidence of hacking on a massive scale by Russia. I mean, literally everything they're working on is like front page news.
Right.
You know, civil rights unrest, front page news. Russia hacking and the Cold War continues, front page news. Wage gaps and economic differential between haves and have-nots, and life expectancies and deaths of despair in the heartland, front page news. 2 different countries, front page news. There was an article, by the way, in the Times yesterday that was just so full of pathos by a woman who grows up in, you know, in a small town in the heartland, so to speak. And she is the youngest. She's kind of like a midlife accident of her mother, and she is able to get out of their small town and go to college. And so she, you know, ends up living in a blue state, in a blue city with a blue perspective. And the rest of her older siblings are all red, and they're all together with their dying mother during the election returns. And she talks about how they share DNA, but because of where they're at, they're just completely different worldviews. That's in yesterday's newspaper. And so all of that is in this book. So Maddie, but I want to ask you, you said it's depressing. Could you say more? Is there another way to look at it other than, you know, we've not solved our problems? Is there some other way to look at it?
Well, I think that it means that we haven't solved our problems. We need to keep working on it. But I did gain some sense of perspective by thinking that these are not new problems for us now. It's been going on for a long time. So maybe we shouldn't beat ourselves up so much if we can't solve them right now, because they haven't been able to solve those problems for several hundreds of years. I think we have to look at maybe why, and are we approaching it the right way? We're giving each of these issues new names, but they're old problems. So there's got to be something wrong in the formula if we still can't solve them. And I think that one of the reasons is that we're made up of people with different viewpoints and different philosophies and different goals. And bringing everyone together to solve these common problems is never easy, clearly.
Yeah. Thank you, Maddie. Annette Miller and then Connie.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah. So I didn't find the epilogue depressing. I found the epilogue energizing. I found it exciting to think that some people, until their dying breath, will continue to strive for those things that they think are still important. I don't, sometimes I think about, do we have to say, well, this is the end of days and I should be winding things up? And it's a question of how you wind things up. And these leaders still thought they had work to do. Now it's something else, Trump feels he has work to do still, so he won't give up. So it's a question of knowing how much effect you can still have, finding the right balance. But I found it, yes, there's nothing new. We have to keep trying. And I think what we found certainly in the Torah is that there's work to be done. And we're not in the promised land. Moses doesn't get there, but there's work to continue to be done. And I find it very exciting to have models like the leaders that Doris Kearns. So I didn't find it down at all. And if some people want to go to Florida, this is good too. And maybe they feel that their work is done, and everyone is kind of different that way. But I found it exciting to think about these leaders wanting to continue. The question is, if you're no longer in control, then how do you make your voice heard when in fact you're not at the top of your game, or that society doesn't see you at the top of your game anymore? So what ways can you continue to do those things which are fulfilling? And I think we all have an obligation to keep on giving back until it's over, and anyway, so I found it invigorating.
Yeah. And that, to your point, by the way, I found there a lot of pathos, both, when LBJ takes I think like the Medicare signing ceremony to Missouri, to Harry Truman. And Harry Truman's an ex-president of the United States. And he says, it's been a long while since I've gotten any kind of respect like that. And then LBJ himself, is very much, feels very vulnerable, and that the Harvard historians are going to spurn him and disdain him. So even perhaps even especially, the higher you go, the farther you fall when you're not when you're not in a cent anymore. And the question is, how do you keep doing the work that you've cared about, in all the later stages of your life? And that's definitely a question that we share with them. Thank you, Ned. Connie, your hand was up.
I found, I was confused when reading the last chapter. At first, I was very sad for the leaders. And then I thought, well, it's hubris, because these huge issues are reflections of who we are, and we're all imperfect. And these issues will probably never go away because of who we are as human beings. So that's what we have to accept. And that'll be work for us forever. That's how I looked at it.
Well, Connie, let me ask you about what you just said. If you posit that these issues are big issues, they're who we are issues, they're not technical issues, they're not I've got a headache, take 2 Tylenol and you feel better issues. These are adaptive change issues. These are systemic issues. These are baked into our DNA type issues, like race and racism, like the polarization of our country, like the different Americas that are one America, like the like the fact that there will always be rich and poor, and capitalism exacerbates that, all of those problems. So those are always going to be here. Therefore, what is it? You use the word hubris. They're like, what should be our response as citizens to these, shall we say, intractable dilemmas?
To continue to work on them, to continue to try to mitigate, but to also understand that to eliminate all of them is daydreaming.
So that's a very profound thought, Connie. In other words, to have the aspiration to work on it and to have the humility to know that you'll never fully succeed. And
Sort
can
of
you
like Sisyphus.
Yes.
Mhm.
Can you carry both? I'm going to work. I'm not going to give up. And by the way, I know I'm never going to reach the promised land, which
Yeah.
is why the Moses piece is going to be, I think, so poignant. The Moses piece is going to be so poignant because the Torah ends on a note of utter failure for Moses. And we'll take a look at it. Like both, he's working and he's reaching and he's striving and he's teaching. And like LBJ going to give that speech about civil rights with his last breath, Moses devotes his last breath to more exhortation. And and in his last exhortation, he says, by the way, it's going to be for naught. You're not going to listen to me. But it doesn't stop him from striving. And can you hold both? I'm going to keep working, keep striving, even as you know, to a certainty, you will fail. And that's the nature of intractable problems. Other thoughts before we pivot to the Holy Torah? Susan Kopelman.
When you say, even though that Moses knew that he wasn't going to get to the promised land, I think most of us, I agree with Dottie, is it?
Yes.
Who was talking? We have children. And what we want is for our children to get closer to where the ideal is, so that we keep working, accepting the fact that we're at the end maybe, but if you have children, it isn't the end. You hope for the next generation and the next generation and whatever. So you can never stop working.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Susan. We say tag to the next generation, you're it, and you'll pick up the race from here. Other thoughts before we pivot to Moses and the end of Deuteronomy? And I want to go to the other screen to make sure that I catch everybody here. Anyone else yes, Judy Swartz. So good to see you, Judy.
So of course, I have got to say to you, I think everybody has to define for themselves what kind of life do they want to live. And if you want to live the purposeful life, it doesn't mean it isn't done in the Southern Chimes, okay? So I have to say to you, every single problem that exists in the North exists down here, and maybe twice as many, because this carries with it when you go to their school system and volunteer and you see other things. It's so mind-boggling. There's so much to do. I'm not a golfer. You're lucky if you play golf, if you can get in the other activities and the ways to make life more meaningful. So I presume there are some people who don't do these kind of things, but my kind of friends do all these kind of things. So I had to say that because you can't, Rabbi, you got to be very careful. We can't generalize and assume everybody's living a la-la life, because there are la-la people in Newton, and those weren't my kind of friends either, all right? And to be Jewish means to live the purposeful life, and that's what you've got to define, and everybody owns it, and everybody owns a chunk of that responsibility, and they answer to themselves, and they answer to God. It's how they carve out life, what's meaningful to them.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, Judy. Amen to everything you said, and you're absolutely right. It's not shaped by geography, and it's not shaped by where you live. It's shaped by how you live, and it's shaped by attitude. And I think that this epilogue, whether you live in Florida or California or Newton or wherever you happen to live, the question is, do you see the chapter that you're in as a chapter of, rest and relaxation and retirement, which is fine. I mean, I truly mean no critique at all. I mean, just as an observation. Or do you see the chapter you're in as a chapter of, you know what, I've got work to do, and I'm at a different age, and I'm at a different stage, and I don't necessarily have the same kinds of I
Energy.
don't have the same kind of platform that I might have had 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but I have the same kind of passion, maybe
Yeah.
even a deeper passion, and I'm going to keep on working. And that, I think, is a fundamental threshold question that this chapter raises. It's not Florida or Newton. It's, are you still engaged in doing the sacred work that's unfinished and unfinishable? Or do you say, you know what, I've done my piece, I've paid my dues, I want to enjoy the rest of my life, and no critique either way. But that's I'm just asking people to think about that threshold question, because it arises from this. What I want to do is I want to take a look at Moses, because this is just so powerful. Moses, this is how the Torah ends. We're on page 1176.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses is now, and in Vayelech, he is 120 years old.
Yep.
And Moses is, so just to set the stage for the part that we're going to look at the very beginning of Vayelech, he says, I am now 120 years old.
Yep.
I can no longer be active. So this is Ben Mea ve'esrim shana anochi. I'm 120. Lo uchal od latzet v'lavo, which literally means I can't go out and come in anymore. And that is to say that when you're in a place of like such physical limitation, that like getting out of your house, getting out of your front door, especially in New England, especially in the winter, especially with weather like this where there's snow and ice, it's just I can't get out on the snow, on the ice, into the car, and out into the world, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why even when we're on the other side of coronavirus and we're all vaccinated and we're all back, we're going to be live streaming our services forever.
Yep.
Because there are people who, even on the other side of coronavirus, are like Moses here, like they can't get out. Lo uchal od latzeit v'lavo. I can't get out. So he's physically, by his own testimony, he's limited. Okay. Now look what happens here. This is just, so it's 120. So he's now, he served his 8 years in office, so to speak, except that it's 40 years. He served his 40 years. And he's at the end, and he knows he's at the end. And look what happens. The Lord said to Moses, you are soon to lie with your fathers.
Yeah, you're gonna die.
So Moses, you're about to die. Okay?
Right
now,
down home.
Here's what happens next. This people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst, in the land that they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them. Then my anger will flare up against them, and I will abandon them and hide my countenance from them. They shall be ready prey, and many evils and troubles shall befall them. And they shall say on that day, surely it's because our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us. And yet I will keep my countenance hidden on that day because of all the evil they have done in turning to other gods. Now, I just want to pause here. This is amazing. Moses is about to die.
Yep.
And God says to him, by the way, Moses, just let me give you one comforting thought before you die. Your entire life work is an utter failure.
No, it isn't.
Here's what's going to happen. When you die, they are going to follow other gods. And as a result of that, they're going to lose the land of Israel. Like you spent 40 years trying to teach them to serve me, the one God. And if they serve me, the one God, they get to stay in the land of Israel. When you die, I'm telling you, they're going to follow other gods and they're going to be kicked out of Israel. Okay. So this is about Marilyn Kalis's point. And this is about Maddie Donna's point. This is about all of our point that this is Connie's point, that these problems are intractable and longstanding and not capable of solution, right? Not susceptible of solution, right? Now then, what's Moses supposed to do? And then I want to take some comments. So what's he going to do? So like, by the way, like when we do when somebody's at the end of their life and they're in their bed and they're surrounded by loved ones, what we try to do is comfort them and give them peace and give them contentment and give them joy that your life was beautiful and that your goals were fulfilled and you're filled with love and blessing, and look back at what you've accomplished. And here God does the lousiest V-doing in the history of the world is what God does for Moses. Right before Moses dies, instead of comforting him and saying, you know, what a beautiful life you've lived, God says to Moses, utter failure. But then one last thing. Therefore, this is God's thing. Therefore, write down this poem and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths in order that this poem may be witness against the people of Israel. When I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, and I promise on oath to their fathers, and they eat their fill and grow fat and turn to other gods and serve them, spurning me and breaking my covenant, and many evils and troubles befall them, then this poem shall confront them as a witness, since it will never be lost from the mouths of their offspring. For I know what plans they are devising even now before I bring them into the land that I promised on oath. That day, Moses wrote down this poem and taught it to the Israelites. So he literally, with Moses's last breath, he's still working on these timeless goals, even though he knows that his timeless goals will come to naught. They will follow false gods. God will be angry at them. They will be kicked out, all of which happens. And Moses' response is not to play golf or do the early bird special. Moses' response is what LBJ does. Moses' response is what Teddy Roosevelt does. Teddy Roosevelt literally spends his last day coming up with this long plan for the Industrial Revolution and dies. And Moses does this last poem, this last speech, and dies. So it's a model, and I wanted to ask for your thoughts. Like, how do you receive this? How does this model make you feel? Bruce Donoff.
In the context of this overall discussion, I just think it's important to mention someone from Brooklyn named Dr. Fauci, who's going to turn 80 the end of this week, and who's as directed and purposeful as anybody could be. And I wonder what people think of his direction, purpose, and what he thinks about what he has left to give.
Thank you.
It's a good example.
Yeah, that is a lovely thought. And I mean, he's, I believe, as close to universally revered and respected in this country as somebody who cuts across red and blue and coast and heartland, etc. And kol hakavod that he's doing this sacred work, right? Other thoughts, but what do you think about Moses having spent 40 years and being 120 and being physically so limited and being on the verge of dying, and God saying, hey, two last things. Number one, you're going to fail. Number two, with your last energy, write this poem. What do you think about that as just a human statement? By the way, guys, this is the end of the Torah. Moses dies on the wrong side of the River Jordan, and the people don't get to the promised land in the Torah. They don't get to the promised land. Just as they're about to get into the promised land, we're snapped back to Genesis. They don't get into the promised land in the Torah. What do you think about that truth? Is the Torah here discerning about the human condition? Is it accurate or is it not accurate? Is this unduly pessimistic? What do you guys think? David Kopelman.
Well, just not necessarily relating to that, but another interesting thing is that many of us are retired. We've had careers. Some of us have enjoyed our careers. Maybe some have not. But the point is, there is something, a benefit or kudos for the ability to pass the baton to the next generation and do it graciously, as opposed to, say, for example, Trump, who is not willing to pass the baton graciously. There is some benefit to that as well, rather than hanging on to the last second and being reluctant to give up any power, glory, eminence. There is something about humility that say, all right, I've run my race, time to graciously leave. And even Moses passed the baton to Joshua and said,
Yeah.
you carry on. So there is some benefit to saying, I'm not going to go with my last ounce of strength. I'm going to be a little gracious and hand the baton to someone a little bit more, who has a little bit more energy, more youth, more stamina, and life goes on.
David, I love that. If you look, just take a look at the last page that I sent you on the handout. This is Moses right before he offers this poem. He says in verse 29, on page 1179, "For I know that when I am dead," can you imagine saying that? "For I know that when I am dead, you will act wickedly and turn away from the path that I enjoined upon you, and that in time to come, misfortune will befall you for having done evil in the sight of the Lord and vexed him by your deeds." And then his response is, "Then Moses recited the words of this poem to the very end in the hearing of the whole congregation of Israel." And the ability to take in sad news and also to keep on going, I think does kind of hinge on humility, that all we can do is our best. That's all any of us can do is our best. And then once we've done that, we let it go, because what can we do? It's in hands that are greater than ours. It's in hands that are greater than ours. And I think Moses must have been able to sleep the sleep of the innocent and just, because he knew he tried, did his best, and now it's on Joshua and the next generation. And in a very real way, all of us play out that drama. So humility is always a great virtue. Any other last thoughts about the epilogue of Moses, the epilogue of these 4 presidents, and our own epilogue? In the market for any thoughts, comments, questions. Here's a fundamental question I want. Oh, Annette.
Is there another way that Moses could have said that? I mean, if you're on your deathbed and you know you've tried your hardest, do you really say to those around you, you're going to be wicked, you're going to fail, bad things are going to happen to you? I mean, couldn't it have been a way, as I have tried? I hope that you will follow some examples. Things will get difficult. There's something a little bit, he keeps on going in the strike of everything, like Sisyphus. He's going to keep on going to his last breath. So in other words, what he says and what he does are 2 different things. He says you're going to be bad. Bad things are going to happen. And yet he writes this poem in his last breath. So what does that have to do, again, with what you say and what you do? So we're judged by our actions, but it seems to me that maybe he could have at least said something a little bit softer.
Yeah, you know what? It's not the way, it's not the vibe in that any of us would want in that setting. In our last moment, it's not the vibe we would want. But Moses is a straight talker. And, we had the conversation last week about the fact that when Aaron dies, all Israel bewails him. When Moses dies, not all Israel bewails him. Maybe he was a bit harsh. And maybe people said, geez Louise, we need a little more love, a little softer touch. I would hope for a softer touch. So I agree with you. There's got to be a softer way. I always have, the voice of Rabbi Chill always in my head. What would Rabbi Chill do? How would Rabbi Chill speak? I don't think Rabbi Chill would talk this way. And I always have the voice of my mother, my late mother, that you get more with honey than with vinegar. That was one of my mother's main teachings. You get more with honey than with vinegar. There's a lot of vinegar here. I'm wondering whether maybe he could have gotten some more with honey. But I will say, so I credit all that, Annette. But what's striking to me is that he knows, he has a sense that he's not crowned with success. It's the opposite, and yet he keeps going.
Yeah.
And that ability, and yet he keeps going. That's what I want to just lift up. Judy Swartz.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, go to the beginning of this chapter, like when he's talking to Joshua, okay?
Yeah.
He's got to be strong. He can't now become Mr. Soft Willie. That's not who he was as a leader. He says to Joshua, God will be with you. He's really talking the covenant to Joshua, and as if to say, he knows things that maybe the people don't know, but he believes in this covenantal relationship. He's been tested by God so many times. He may sound negative, but there it is when he's talking to Joshua. God will not forsake you. He's talking a reality to the people, because for him to now change how he talks would not be in keeping with his character, all right? But he's told Joshua who will succeed him. God will stay with you. This is the covenant. Carry it on. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's as negative as it sounds. I think this is how he's got to keep talking strong and tough to the people. He says, he somehow knows that bad things will befall them. Why, he's going to leave it to Joshua to say, hang in there, all right? Because that's what it's all about.
Thank you, Judy. I wanted to end just on a nice little kind of, well, it's not really an up note, but it's a note that I didn't know, and I credit Doris Kearns Goodwin for sharing this. To me, when you step back from all of this, while they're all for great presidents, etc., to me, since we're studying this in a religious context in synagogue, I think Abraham Lincoln is as close as America comes to Jesus Christ. That is literally true. That is somebody who is noble and idealistic and dies on the cross for our nation's sins. He is, and by the way, this is not a chiddush, this is not a new insight. I mean, there's a lot's been written about Lincoln as Jesus Christ, a secular Jesus Christ. He fights, he gives, he dies for our sins, and he's as close as we come to that. What I did not know about Lincoln, and it was just, and this gave me a warm glow, although then also sadness, is that his very last day was a sweet day, right? That his he had nothing but tough cabinet meetings during the war. And finally, the war was won, and Ulysses Grant and he were on the same page. Let's not punish the Southerners. Let's let them come back to our country. How do we really do charity towards all and malice towards none? And that he was finally at peace. And then, he had these two moments on his last night where he's a raconteur and he's telling stories before dinner and after dinner, and he's telling jokes and he's telling stories, and he's finally at peace. And then, to his word, he goes to the ill-fated play and is assassinated. But I just, whereas Moses on his last day is dealing with the patina of failure and rejection, and it's not going to work, at least Moses on his last day felt that the war was won, which it was, that the South was going to be taken back with charity towards all and malice towards none, and that they were on the right path. And he finally felt some modicum of peace, and that's when he was shot. Okay, so now I want to just talk to you for a minute about the question I asked you at the end of last week. Yeah. Did any of you have a chance to take a look at Caste by Isabel Wilkerson? Yeah. And I would just like to see, for those of you who have read it, okay, I just like to see, or have started to read it, to familiarize yourself with it. I just want to get a basic sense of the room or of the screen. How many of you would be open to our reading that for our next book, paired with wine and cheese, Jewish text as well? Okay, so it feels like there is a majority of folks. I think it's to me, it's a logical next book to read because it deals with a lot of the issues that we have been dealing with in this book. It deals with the issues that Abraham Lincoln dealt with, that Lyndon Baines Johnson dealt with, that really Teddy Roosevelt and FDR also dealt with. And it gives us a whole new construct. So I would, oh, by the way, one other thing is that I've reached out to Jeremy. I thought it would be interesting to read this book with a Black church, to get a Black citizen's perspective on this book. And so so Jeremy Battle and his church, the Western Avenue Baptist Church, and us, we're going to read it in the winter on Zoom, obviously. But we're going to be having some Zoom calls where Pastor Battle and I will kind of co-teach this book with a white Jewish and a Black Baptist audience.
Great.
And that way we can be in dialogue. And it's just a whole new move for how I had never thought about caste. I just had never thought about caste as a construct, as a category. And it's just, I don't know, I'm not advocating that she's right. I'm just advocating that she's thoughtful and she's bringing some new ideas. So our class is cast. I will be back in, there's not class next week, and there's not going to be class the first week in January, but I will be emailing you with our first start date, but that's going to give you plenty of time to get cast and to start reading it. Get cast and start reading it, and we'll be in touch with the date for our next class at some point in January. And I promise you a wine. I promise you a wine and cheese pairing of cast and a Jewish text. Hey guys, can I just say thank you. This class has been, 2020 has obviously been a challenging year, but this class has been a great blessing. And I'm deeply grateful for your friendship and for your learning every week. And I will see you in 2021.
Thank you, Wes, so much. It was so good.
Thank you guys. Lots of love. Thank you. Bye.
Terrific.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone stay well.
You too.
Yeah,
Happy
well. Yeah, take care.
You'll hear from
Sunshine
me in
is
January.
coming.
Healthy New
Yeah,
Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New
Hi,
Year.
Danny.
Take care.
That's it.
Get your shots. We're all eligible.